Hello, everybody. So today we are going to move forward from World War One and talk about the time period in between World War One and World War Two. So getting to some of the contextual things that are going on in the world after World War One and how this might lead to World War Two. So looking at Europe after the war, really the biggest point to make is that after a war that had never really been seen before in terms of the amount of devastation, the amount of killing, the amount of deaths, Europe is really left decimated. And this is both for those that won the war, like France, especially, and Britain, but also those who lost the war, like Germany or Austria um, and Hungary as well. And so, within this, millions of people are dead. Economies are in ruins due to this destruction that has occurred. And then in 1919, so shortly after the end of the war, the Spanish flu epidemic sweeps through a lot of these countries, and this would also kill even millions of more people. And so the economic, and because politics is oftentimes tied to economic realities and people's ability to get the things that they need, the end of World War One had brought these on, and this would lead the world bound for collision towards a second world war. So looking at Germany in particular after the war, obviously we talked about with the Treaty of Versailles that Germany is really placed front and center as being blamed for the war. They have to accept all responsibility for the war. They have to pay off all debts to the war and all destruction that has been caused by the war. They cannot have a military of any great size. They have to really limit down, in a lot of ways, they have been made powerless by the Treaty of Versailles. And so Germany went through a long period of economic depression because of these truths and realities, in addition to the embarrassment that came from being blamed for the war and the embarrassment from the course of the war and everything else, leading to social and political upheaval. And so this really is going to take place in several different ways, but if we're just breaking down where Germany is economically, socially, and politically, if we're starting off with economic, again, they're forced to pay for reparations for the entire war. They had been badly damaged themselves, not only from a loss of young men who might make up a lot of their workforce, but also from damages to buildings and the fighting. And so until 1924, so 5-6 years after the war, the German people had also gone through a period of hyperinflation. And so this is inflation where prices are rising on all goods and forcing people to pay sometimes millions of dollars for just simple, everyday items. And so everything went up dramatically in price because they continued to print more and more money, and this devalued the German dollar even more. So, for example, that I have written right here, in December of 1923, so 5 years after the war ended, a loaf of bread cost 428 billion Deutschmarks, so their version of the dollar. And so this really crippled the German economy. People are not doing well. And so by 1924, though, Germany starts to get themselves out of this economic depression. They start to rebuild themselves in some ways. They start to be in a better place. And so for the rest of the 20s, they start to build themselves back up into a power. Socially, there is a lot of embarrassment going on for Germany. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of sadness from the loss of life, from the loss of the war. And so Germany really feels like they've been singled out as the bad guy in front of the entire world. And this leads to social upheaval in terms of questioning, because they've just fought this war due to feelings that the German people were superior to others, or this strong sense of nationalism to, show all the things that the German people can do. And, out of a loss like this came a lot of feelings of, like I said, embarrassment and possible inadequacy. And so political groups like the Nazis would spring on this embarrassment and these feelings of culture and ties to the German culture and use that in order to gain power later on. And then, of course, politically, I've already mentioned a little bit of this. During the aftermath of World War I, Germany becomes a democratic republic. And so they have a democratic reform of government known as the Weimar Republic. And this would be created in this, interwar period. But due to the economic upheaval felt in the early 20s, and then also the social upheaval, there were some political groups that ended up attempting to overthrow the republic, feeling like they were not representing Germany in the best way, and trying to represent it or replace it with either socialist or fascist forms of government. And so here we see just some of these economic woes. All of the pictures here, in terms of people doing things, are actually people using money because it was essentially worthless, at the time, in order to get things. So a woman in the top left corner has made a dress out of the Deutschmarks. Children are making kites out of the Deutschmarks. And people really felt like, because it's costing $428 billion just to get a loaf of bread, that it's essentially, a worthless, it's so low in value on a dollar by dollar basis that they're just going to do other things with these dollars. And you can see in the bottom left corner there just how far up inflation had driven, especially in the early 1920s. So as we talked about, some of the countries in the aftermath of World War I, especially in Europe, are having to rebuild. And this is, wiping out their economy in some ways and making it hard to gain traction. But one country that was not in that position, because the fighting had not taken place in their country, was the United States. And so the United States throughout the 20s went through a very prosperous time. And so there wasn't physical damage. They got into the war late. There weren't as many deaths as many of the European countries faced. And so because of that, the U.S. is in a good position. They are a world power, and are the strongest they had ever been to that point. And so this prosperity and optimism, that times were really good, led many Americans to start to invest in the stock market. And a stock is buying a portion or a percentage of a company. And for each stock, you sort of, buy based on the price that it is that day. And you could sell later on down the road for a potentially large profit. And so even during this time in which there's a lot of optimism, everyone wants to start getting in on the stock market. However, not everyone has the extra money to be able to pay for the stocks. And so what ended up happening is that a lot of people started to borrow money or agree to pay back the price of the stock later on. And this would be called buying on margin. Unfortunately, though, what ended up happening was that the good times did not last. And so the stock market ends up crashing in 1929, and a lot of people did not necessarily have the money to pay back the stocks that they had bought on loan. And so on October 29th, 1929, there seemed to be trouble on the horizon, but this is known as Black Tuesday. And on this day, the American stock market crashed. It lost a lot of value. It lost about 12% of its value in one day. And what this did was that it shook Americans' confidence to the point where people felt like my bank may close. They may not have enough money to give me the money that I've put into the bank. Because what ends up happening with banks is that your money does not just sit there. It gets loaned out to people. And so, a lot of people coming in on one day to take their money out would be really disastrous for banks. And so, this stock market crash spooked so many people that people are trying to get their money out. Banks are closing. Because the banks are closing, there's not as much money to be loaned out to other companies, which are going to put them in a bad position. And so all of it sort of shows how tied together the economy was, and how this chaos of the moment was leading to a lot of problems in America at first, and then eventually, as we'll talk about, in Europe as well. And so the collapse of the stock market in the U.S. economy, this is considered the major driver of the Great Depression, sort of the starting moment. Even though there was a lot of different causes, this was sort of the start of that Great Depression. And so because world trade at this time as well had grown so much, and because the U.S. was one of the main loaners of money during this time, and because the U.S. is now going through a depression, the economies of so many other countries were interconnected with ours, and the economic crisis began to spread throughout the world. And so looking at the international economy, really the American stock market crashing in October of 1929 led to American banks stopping to loaning money internationally and in the US as well. And so this starts to drag Europe down into this depression as well. And so the banks end up beginning to demand repayment of loans already made, many of which were international as well as U.S. loans. And due to World War I, still affecting them in ways, many countries in Europe now were not able to pay back their loans. And this even included Germany and Austria not being able to pay back reparations for paying for the damages done. And so all of these, economies are, being dragged down into this Great Depression. And so in addition to, American banks taking the actions of not loaning out money, the U.S. government also raised what are called tariffs. And a tariff is a tax on an imported good. So any goods that are brought in from foreign places, a tax is put on them. And so raising tariffs was seen as a way to force more people to buy American goods. If we raise a tariff on a good coming from, say, Germany, then people are going to buy the American good because it's cheaper than the German good. Now, what ends up happening is that other countries then raise tariffs on any goods coming into their country. And so, if we raise tariffs on goods coming from other countries like England, okay, England then raises a tariff saying that, it's going to cost more for American goods over here, and that leads to, some of these markets for American goods to sort of dry up. They're not as good because people are going to buy the cheaper good, especially at a time in which they don't have a lot of money, such as what we're seeing here. And so this is really a mess. As businesses start to close, people are not buying their products as much. People do not have the money to buy these products. All of these things are happening, which are going to lead to not only a falling of trade, but also just a greater impact from this Great Depression. And so really what we're seeing here is that, one of the major, effects and immediate effects of the Great Depression was the failure of banks and financial institutions, which are loaning out money to businesses. These businesses employ people. And so as these banks fail, businesses start to fail because they can't get money to, for loans to pay their people or to open up, businesses. And so, this ends up creating a bigger financial crisis than it was before. And so by 1933, 1/4 of all American workers were unemployed. And this is a huge number. I think during the Great Recession in the early 2010s, late 2000s, there were about 12, 13, 14% of people who are unemployed. So this is twice that. So as we talked about earlier, a lot of times economic factors will lead to social and political factors changing as well. And so even though this is a Great Depression, it's economic, it's going to impact societies, because if people do not have what they need, including money to pay for food, pay for housing, get jobs, they're going to start to blame the government and start to look for people that might be able to help them. And so out of this Great Depression and out of the end of World War I in some of these European countries and Asian countries, we start to see a rise of what is called fascism. And so as the economy begins to fail more and more, and as people become more tired of especially in places like Germany, more angry about the circumstances that led to the end of the First World War and the ways in which they were blamed for the war, they start to look to charismatic leaders who say that everything's going to be all right if you put your faith in them. And so they're going to provide strong leadership, and strong power and strong authority. And this is known as fascism. And so fascism is a political movement that believes in an extreme form of nationalism, right? So the nation is the most important thing. In the case of someone like Hitler, he's saying that he's going to return Germany to the great cultural heights and the power and the influence that they were going to show. It denies people individual rights because the nation is the number one most important thing. And so, breaking individual rights and putting the nation above all is the most important thing. And it's also led by a one-party dictatorship. So in the case of Hitler, that's going to be the Nazis. And so the Nazis are a fascist political organization, and these types of governments were starting to pop up all over the place as people begin questioning more and more democratic governments because of everything going on. So the last thing that I want to talk about here, because it's incredibly relevant towards looking at how fascism was able to grow, was the League of Nations. So we talked about the League of Nations very quickly in the effects of World War I and looking at Wilson's 14 points. And the League of Nations was established at the end of World War I through this Treaty of Versailles. It was a way to have nations solve their issues through diplomacy and cooperation. It's the only one of U.S. President Wilson's 14 points to be adopted. But it faced a lot of challenges. For one, even though this was an American idea, the U.S. Congress ended up rejecting joining the League of Nations. And this became a problem because the U.S. was a very strong world power. And so having their voice there was going to be big in deterring conflict. We had a very strong military. We had a strong economy. Like I said earlier, we didn't face the damage that a lot of European nations did. The League of Nations also did not have a military force of its own. And so as it's passing rules and laws for nations to follow in cooperation with each other, if another nation broke that, they didn't necessarily have the muscle to sort of ensure that other countries would follow the rules of the League of Nations. The other one here is that in order to pass a resolution, the League had to have a unanimous decision. So if even one country stood against a rule that, you know, the League of Nations wanted, then it would fail. And so this was quite an issue. And so these weaknesses of the League of Nations, as, you know, powers such as Hitler and the Nazis, or Mussolini in Italy, or the Japanese start to rise and start to test and challenge the power of the League of Nations, the League of Nations is sort of powerless to be able to do anything. And so even within this League of Nations, certain countries like Germany or Italy or Japan are attacking countries that are in the League of Nations as well, and it's not going to sort of be the success that people thought it would be. All right, so next class we're going to continue talking about the rise of fascism. Hopefully today you got some of the context surrounding, you know, how these leaders were able to take the reality of the situation and the environments and the economic downturns that happened with the Great Depression and turn it into power for themselves. If you have any questions, please let me or Mr. Allard know, and have a great day.